All right, today we're tackling a big one, the Vietnam War. It's one of the most complicated and divisive conflicts in American history. We're going to look at how the world's biggest superpower got tangled up in a war that cost so much and ended in failure. Let's dive in.
And that really is the question, isn't it? It's not a simple answer. It's a messy story of flawed strategies, domestic politics, and a massive misunderstanding of the conflict itself. But before we get into the how, let's talk about the stakes. And the best way to do that is to look at the cost.
58,279. That's the number of American service members who never came home. Just let that sink in for a second. An almost unimaginable human toll for a war fought thousands of miles from American shores. And then there was the money, $168 billion. To put that in perspective, in today's money, you're looking at well over $1 trillion, a staggering amount of national treasure that actually put a lid on President Johnson's Great Society programs back home.
So you've got this immense sacrifice of lives, of money, of the very unity of the country. And for what? It all ended in a humiliating defeat. The fall of Saigon in 1975 was a huge blow to American prestige and confidence. So yeah, how did it happen? Let's break it down.
Okay, so here's our roadmap. We'll start with the seeds of the conflict, planted in Cold War fears. Then we'll get into the massive escalation, the crucial turning point that changed everything, the long and bitter end, and finally, we'll look at the war's lasting shadow. All right, Section 1. So, to really understand Vietnam, you have to zoom out, way out. The story doesn't actually start in the jungles of Southeast Asia. It starts with the Cold War, this global stare-down between the United States and the Soviet Union. The big idea guiding everything the U.S. did back then was a policy called containment. And it's pretty much what it sounds like. Contain communism, stop it from spreading, draw a line in the sand and say, no further. So when Truman first sent some military advisors to help the French in 1950, that's exactly what he thought he was doing. And that policy of containment led to this, the domino theory. You can just picture it, right? The idea was that if one country, in this case South Vietnam, fell to communism, its neighbors would topple right over, one after another, just like dominoes. From Washington's view, China had just fallen, Korea was a stalemate, so this felt very, very real. And look, this wasn't some wild theory from the fringes. This came right from the top. Here's President Kennedy himself in 1961. He saw losing South Vietnam not just as a loss of territory, but as a huge psychological blow. It would make communism look like the wave of the future. And that thinking justified getting in deeper and deeper. And you can literally see it happening, step by tiny step, president by president. Truman sends a few advisors. Then Eisenhower sends more to train the South Vietnamese army. And then Kennedy just blows the doors off, taking the number of advisors from 900 to over 16,000. It's like quicksand, right? Every step in made it that much harder to pull back out. So now we're moving into the next phase, the Great Escalation. After Kennedy, Lyndon B. Johnson inherits this mess. And one single, really murky incident is about to transform America's role from advisor to full-on combatant. And man, did it happen fast. In August of '64, you have this thing called the Gulf of Tonkin incident. There's an alleged attack on a U.S. ship. The details were super confusing even then, and later a lot of it was disputed. But it was all the justification Johnson needed. Congress gave him what was basically a blank check, and boom, less than a year later, bombs are dropping and U.S. Marines are landing. And this chart, wow, this shows you exactly what that blank check meant. Look at that jump. We go from about 21,000 advisors to over 500,000 U.S. soldiers on the ground in just 5 years. This wasn't advising anymore. This was America's war, full stop. So what was the strategy with all those troops? Well, the guy in charge, General Westmoreland, had this idea of a war of attrition. Basically, the plan was to just kill so many of the enemy that they'd eventually give up. The goal wasn't to capture territory. Success, every single day, was measured by the body count. Which brings us to the turning point. For a while, the story being told back home was, we're winning, the numbers are good, there's a light at the end of the tunnel. But in 1968, that light was about to get switched off. I mean, listen to this from General Westmoreland in mid-1967. He's basically telling the American people, hey, we could be out of here in 2 years. That was the official line. Total confidence.
and it set the stage for a massive, massive shock. And here it is, January 30th, 1968, the Tet Offensive. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong launched this absolutely huge coordinated surprise attack all across South Vietnam. Now, here's the crazy part. Militarily, it was a disaster for them. They took massive losses. But psychologically, for the folks back home watching on their TVs, it changed everything.
Because the fallout was immense. Suddenly, people were asking, wait a minute, if we're winning, how could they possibly do that? This was the famous credibility gap. The government was saying one thing, and the reality on the news looked completely different. Protests exploded. The political cost was so high that President Johnson just gave up. He announced he wouldn't even run for re-election.
Okay, so Johnson's out. Richard Nixon wins the presidency, promising peace with honor. And that phrase is key. The goal wasn't to win anymore. The goal was to get out without looking like they'd lost. And his plan had a name: Vietnamization. It's a simple idea, really. The U.S. would slowly pull its own troops out and at the same time train and equip the South Vietnamese army so they could, hopefully, handle the fight on their own. But getting out was messy. In a move that seemed to completely contradict the whole getting out plan, Nixon expanded the war into neighboring Cambodia. For a lot of Americans, it felt like a betrayal. It sparked furious protests, including the tragedy at Kent State, where National Guardsmen shot and killed 4 students.
But despite all that chaos, the withdrawal itself kept going. You can see the troop levels just plummet. By the time the Paris Peace Accords were signed in early '73, the U.S. combat mission was officially over. The last troops were home. But peace with honor didn't last. The South Vietnamese army, without that massive American support, just couldn't hold on. And just 2 years later, it was over. North Vietnamese tanks rolled into Saigon. The war was done, and South Vietnam was gone.
So let's talk about that long shadow. Because even after the last helicopter left Saigon, the war wasn't really over. Its impact on America, on its politics, its culture, its place in the world, well, it's still being felt today. When you look at the final tally, it's just staggering. The numbers speak for themselves. Almost 60,000 Americans killed, more than 3 million served. And for the Vietnamese people, on both sides, the cost was just unimaginable. We're talking millions of lives lost. And all of that led to something called the Vietnam Syndrome. It was this deep-seated reluctance, this national trauma and skepticism about getting bogged down in another foreign war. For a whole generation, it shaped almost every conversation about U.S. foreign policy. And maybe this quote from General Maxwell Taylor, one of the guys who planned the war, sums it all up best. It's a stunning admission, really. A total failure to understand the culture, the politics, the history, a failure to understand what they were getting into. You know, the questions that Vietnam raised, they didn't just disappear in 1975. They kept coming up again and again in later events. To see how all that played out, you should definitely check out the next explainer in our U.S. history playlist. And hey, if you got something out of this one, do us a favor and hit that like and subscribe button. It really helps us keep making more. So I'll leave you with this question. What is the real lesson of Vietnam? Is it that America should avoid intervention at all costs? Or is it that if you're going to intervene, you better have clear goals and a deep understanding of the situation on the ground? It's a tough one, and it's a debate that is still very much alive today. Let me know what you think down in the comments.